Hello, this is the Grease Gobbler, and welcome to the Freedom of Speech video tutorial series. Now, this is not going to be some activist video where I discuss your First Amendment rights. However, if you've been wondering how you can host your own website on your personal computer in your bedroom, then you've come to the right place, because in this series, I'm going to show you how to do it. And it's not going to cost you 1 red cent. Now, one good thing about hosting your own website is that you can write or say anything you want without being censored by anyone. You simply let your conscience be your guide until the law catches up with you. So let me show you the list of steps that we're going to take in order to set up our free website. Now, I'm not going to go through and read this list to you because I'm long on information and short on time. However, I should mention that I won't be going down this list starting at step 1 and doing each item sequentially. For example, I'm not going to do number 1 first, get a free domain name, because although that step is necessary and very important, it's boring, and my audience would probably go to sleep on me. Okay, so the very first thing I want to do, wake up, actually isn't even on this list. I want to discuss the hardware that we're going to need in order to host our free website. So here we see a schematic of the absolute bare bones minimum hardware configuration that you will need in order to host your website. Okay, so we have a web server computer hosting a website called johnsmith.com. Now, the truth is, if you want to host a free website, you can't have the name johnsmith.com. For one thing, it's taken. Like most every decent .com name is taken. But more to the point, you can't have anything .com because you'd have to pay for that. But this is the Freedom of Speech tutorial series. So we'll be getting a free domain name, but it won't be anything .com. Now, once your website is up and running, you'll be serving your website to the rest of the world through the Apache Web Server. And as it turns out, Apache is the most popular and widely used web server in the world. And I suspect that one thing that contributes to its fantastic popularity is the fact that it is free, which is great, because after all, this is the Freedom of Speech video tutorial series. So, we'll be using our cable modem to go out through our internet service provider to be launched into the living rooms of about 9 billion people throughout the rest of the world. Now, I won't go into great detail to describe what an internet service provider is. I suspect that everyone is painfully aware of who they send their money to every month. But I would like to mention that in return for your prompt monthly payment, your internet service provider is going to give you a short-term lease for a dynamic external IP address. And for this example, I wrote 58.68.224.10. Now, I don't know whose IP address that is. It could be in China for all I know. I just picked these numbers out of the blue so that I could write something down on this diagram. You'll be getting some IP address, but it's highly unlikely it'll be that one. And I'll be discussing the meaning of the terminology in a couple of minutes. Now, this bare-bones computer system will work to host your website out of your bedroom, but it has big problems. In fact, its shortcomings are so severe that I really don't want to discuss it anymore. So let's now look at a more reasonable minimum configuration that you can use to host your free website. In this new minimum computer network, I have added one computer and a router. The new computer that I added, I'm going to call your internet computer. This is your favorite computer. It's the one that you use for all of your work. It has your pictures, your music, your movies, your PowerPoint presentations. It's the computer that you're going to use to design your website. And after the website is finished, you will load your johnsmith.com folder onto a flash drive and transfer it over to your web server computer. Now, I've shown your internet computer is connected to the router with a dashed line to signify that it is connected to the internet in a wireless manner, because nowadays most people are probably carrying their laptops around with them, and when they get on the internet, it's a wireless connection. In addition, I've shown in the diagram that the internet computer uses the Internet Explorer web browser to surf the net. Obviously, you can use any web browser you want. You could be a fan of Firefox or Chrome, Safari, Netscape, SeaMonkey. There's about 1,000 web browsers out there. And the only reason I put Internet Explorer on this diagram is because that's the one that came with Windows. On the other hand, the web server computer should be thought of as your old clunker computer. It's that old computer that you threw down in the basement 5 years ago when you bought your new computer. It is so old that it won't support the latest hardware. And just as important, that old hardware won't support the latest operating systems like Windows 7. So on your web server computer, you're going to be stuck with Windows XP. Don't worry about it. Windows XP will work just fine for this application. Now, when you pull that old computer out of the basement, or maybe you're walking down the street and you see that someone is throwing away an old 700 megahertz Pentium 2 or an Athlon. So you pick it up, and you know good and well you're going to have to reformat the hard drive and install a fresh copy of Windows XP. So let me remind you, or inform you as the case may be, that Microsoft is no longer providing updates for Windows XP. So when you install your new operating system, at the very least you should make sure that you install Service Pack 3 on top of it. Also, since Windows XP comes with Internet Explorer 6.0, you're going to want to install version 8.0 on top of it. Of course, it would be nice if you could install Internet Explorer 9.0, but I don't think they made a version of 9.0 that would go on Windows XP. And since they've turned their back on XP, I don't expect to see one coming anytime soon. Now, if you don't know how to install Windows XP on a computer, now would be a good time for you to learn. It's not that hard, and you definitely need to start with a clean copy. So ask one of the neighborhood kids to show you how to do it. And hey, if you mess it up, it was an old clunker computer anyway. Of course, you could pay me to show you how, but I would have to charge you for making a house call, and that would be contrary to the spirit of the freedom of speech philosophy. Now, at any point in time, all websites are sitting at some IP address out on the internet. And in the case of John Hancock, oops, did I say Hancock? I meant John Smith. In the case of johnsmith.com, the IP address is 58.68.224.10. Now, each one of the numbers in the IP address can take on a range of values from 0 to 255. At least that's the way it was back in the days of IPv4. Now that we're moving into IP version 6, things have changed, but let's not get into that. The word dynamic means that your IP address can change at any time. Of course, it might not change. Maybe it'll stay the same for weeks, or maybe it'll change in 5 minutes. Normally, you don't care. The router is set up to detect any change and continue its work without interruption. In addition, in the previous picture of the bare bones one computer network, when there was no router, the computer also was configured to detect any change in the external IP address and continue its work without interruption. So normally, no one knows when their IP address changes, and no one really cares either. And for all you guys out there who for sometimes surreptitious reasons change your IP address, no need to inform me that there are plenty of exceptions to what I just said. Oh, and before I leave this topic, I should also mention that if you decide that you would rather have a static IP address, I'm confident that your internet service provider would be happy to supply you with one. But don't be surprised if your monthly bill goes up. Okay, so we know what an IP address is, and we know what dynamic means. The external refers to the internet side of the router. Imagine a fence, and put all of the computers in your house inside of that fence, and let the router sit right on the gate. External IP addresses are on the outside of the fence and are assigned to us by the internet service provider. Internal IP addresses are on the inside of the fence and are assigned to each computer by the router. So let's look at the router. It's normally a piece of equipment that people ignore, but the router will play a central role in allowing you to host your own website, so you will need to become more familiar with what it does. In my bedroom, I have a Netgear router, model FR114P. The BIOS of all FR114Ps have precisely the same internal IP address, and that is 192.168.0.1. If you have a Linksys router or any model other than what I have, then your internal IP address will be different. And I should mention that the Netgear company does not call this a BIOS. They call it a server. But I don't like that word, because when I hear the word server, I think of one of these, a computer tower with a keyboard and a flat panel display. But when I look at the server inside of a router, I see what looks like an Excel spreadsheet. It's full of words and numbers. But what it really looks like is the BIOS inside of any computer. So that's why I call it a BIOS. And I'm sure that the whole world is laughing at me for my ignorance. But that's all right. Just don't go repeating it, or you might find that they're laughing at you too. Now, we will come back to this BIOS later when it's time to forward the ports on the router. For now, I just want to make sure that you understand the difference between a static and a dynamic internal IP address. And again, I don't think I'm using the customary terminology, but I think you'll understand what I'm trying to say. Normally, when you connect your computer to a router, the router provides you with a dynamic internal IP address that will stay the same as long as you're connected to the router. However, if you disconnect your computer and then come back later and reconnect to the router, the particular IP address that the router assigns to you might be different. In that sense, it's dynamic, and the computer is configured to detect whatever IP address is offered and to happily accept it with no complaints. In the case of the Netgear FR114P router, the internal IP address that is assigned will always start with 192.168.0, and the last number can be any number from 0 to 255. That's up to the router to decide. So you can connect up to 255 different computers to this router simultaneously. Oh, and remember, that last number can't be a 1 because the BIOS has an address of 1. So in this example, I have imagined that the router gave this computer the dynamic internal IP address of 5. However, in the case of the clunker computer, things are radically different because the Apache Web Server software will not tolerate a dynamic internal IP address. For that reason, you have to configure your clunker computer and your router and your Apache Web Server software to all agree on the same static internal IP address. If you don't get all three of them to agree, then you won't have a website. So as I said before, since the internal IP address can be any number between 0 and 255, except that it can't be 1, I just picked the number 254 and assigned it to the clunker computer. So let me review. Since the Internet Explorer does not care whether the internal IP address is static or dynamic, of course you will choose dynamic because it makes life easier for you. And in that case, the router assigns the value of the internal IP address. And in this case, it's 5. But in the case of the web server, since Apache demands that the internal IP address must be static, then the computer tells the router what IP address it demands, and the router happily complies with the request. And in this case, it's 254. Now, I suspect that there are some technical experts out in YouTube land who are cringing at some of my technical errors. So let me just say, I was so tightly constrained by the 15-minute time limit of these YouTube videos that I did not have time to introduce the concept of ports on the router. As a result, I was forced to make generous use of my artistic license in describing the requirements of the Apache Web Server. I'll try to resolve my inaccuracies in a later video when I have more tools at my disposal. Now, I suspect that there are some people out there in YouTube land who are thinking that all of this stuff that I just described seems incredibly tedious and complicated, and I'm inclined to agree. But the truth is, the process of configuring this software and the equipment is a set of very simple step-by-step procedures, no more complicated than typing a few numbers into the right box. So don't let all of this background information scare you away from hosting your own website. No one expects that you'll be able to configure the Apache Web Server with what little information that I have provided in the past 15 minutes. The configuration instructions will come later. Looking ahead to the next video, we're actually going to skip ahead to step number 5 on our list. Together we will download the Apache Web Server software, and then you can watch me as I install it on my own computer. In the meantime, I'm going to reformat my hard drive and reinstall Windows XP on my own clunker computer, so when I come back, we will both be starting from the same starting point. So until next time, this is the Grease Gobbler.